Mm. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Arnis Luks here at the Freedom Forum, and I'd like to welcome my guest panelists again from Canada. Welcome, Robert Klinck.
Hello, Arnie. Good to see you again.
No worries. Pleased to have you, Robert. And Brother Wallace. Welcome, Wallace.
Hi there, Arnie. We're enjoying a beautiful, what I guess you would call Indian summer now. It's around 20 degrees and a little bit of rain, but generally pretty bright. Very nice.
That's lovely. We've got a little bit of rain overnight. 25 yesterday, 25 the day before, and today's cooling down to about 15 with the rain. But we're okay with that because I think a couple of days we're up to 30. So spring is certainly here. Budburst is everywhere, and we've spent the last few days in the garden. It's been a lovely time. Even got a bit of a tan. So yeah, I don't know if you blokes would be used to it, but I have no issue going around bare-chested in the summer, especially in the garden. I like a bit of colour, and I think I even got a bit sunburnt yesterday. So there you go. There you go.
Well, I guess we don't have anything to really complain about personally, so we'll have to complain about the state of the world.
That's right. That's right. The world itself, the physical world, is in a beautiful state. I must admit that I've got barley and oats. The grasses are it's spring, and the grasses are at least 2.5 feet high. It's the growth this winter has been phenomenal, and I'm plucking it or pulling the weeds and hand feeding the sheep as I do the gardening and prepare the beds. But boy, it's been a really good winter. The growth has been prolific. I know there are parts in Australia that are under drought. Having just toured central New South Wales, western New South Wales, but this is an area where it borders on the desert, and so it is marginal anyway. You're aware that it's marginal, and it's quite frustrating when it's extended. The drought extends for years, and of course the hardship for the farmers. So I guess we do have, while it's not all beer and skittles. Um, the recent hurricanes that have gone up the east coast of America. There's difficulties there, so just acknowledging that the world is a variety of different circumstances, and obviously the people who in is it the Bahamas, they have to accommodate it with the design. I know that when Darwin in Australia got flattened by Cyclone Tracy, virtually a building wasn't left standing. They changed the building code, and so they put solid concrete foundations down with rods that went all the way through the frames up to the rafters and tied the roof down with steel rods to the concrete. And so obviously they've had cyclones go through again, but because the building code had been changed, then those buildings held. So yes, we can accommodate, we can adapt to the environment, to the circumstances, whether it's hot, cold, or even cyclone weather. We can
as
adapt.
long as we have the financial means to do so.
Well, that's right.
I don't know if the people in the Bahamas generally are in that position.
No,
they
that's right.
they could have solid structures for their homes, but
That's right.
they can't afford them probably.
No, they couldn't afford to because obviously I would doubt that they'd have the steel facilities or concrete facilities there to produce their own, so they'd have to import, and of course they'd have to exchange something for it. And that really comes back to, I guess, the purpose. What is the purpose of the productive system? What is the purpose of or if you like, the policy of the financial system? What is its purpose? What is its function? And if we look at the situation we find ourselves in, and the title for today's address, World Government, the purpose, if you like, the policy of the existing current financial system is world government. And the title for today is The Antidote to World Government. What is it? What is the actual answer? And I think there are many branches in this tree of the answer or the key. And I'm going to let you blokes start with your thoughts. Robert Klinck.
Well, the history of the 20th century and even before that reveals that there are powerful financial interests that are promoting policies of centralization that the ordinary citizen has not been aware of.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this is changing now because of the speed and facility of communications. And therefore, this issue of world government is becoming increasingly critical, more critical, because it is being consolidated in order to stave off the spread of information about the activities of these financial institutions. Mm-hmm. Most people go around their, they attend to their affairs, they're in their smallish world, but these bankers are thinking of things in global terms. And it was New York bankers who financed the Russian Revolution. Mm-hmm. The rise of the Nazi government in Germany was financed by, in part, the Bank of England. So you have to have an understanding that the thinking of these financial institutions is not designed necessarily to improve the lot of the average citizen. We like to think of our governments as being kind of philanthropic, disposed favorably toward us, and really having good intentions toward us. But all of these governments are subject to financial control. And if you study history, you will soon see that the finance is international and it is not philanthropic at all. I mean, our history is littered with wars and depressions, everything else. All of them basically artificial and contrived. So this need to combat the imposition of a world government becomes increasingly urgent.
Very good opening salvo. Thank you, Robert. Your thoughts, Wally Klinck?
Well, it is extremely urgent. I think it's absolutely critical to the destiny of the human race, actually. You have to, I suppose, go back to philosophical considerations and consider the nature of human life, the nature of the conscious human mind or being. To what extent is that mind intended to be developed, creative, independent? To what extent is it necessary, as some people contend, that the individual must be subject to much external influence and pressure in order for things to be done in a way that will make life possible on this earth? I think the banking system it spans the globe. It is universal. It is all embracing, with its tentacles touching, embracing everything. And you cannot do anything without the issue of credit, and credit is invested in the financial system, the power to create credit. And credit is the only thing that can actuate human ambition, abilities and creativity, because you need resources, and you can't get resources unless you have credit, which allows you to claim resources for a given project. Now, there are many problems that have been caused by the financial system. The problem of inflation, the problem of the pendulum economy that swings back and forth, bringing great prosperity and then great ruination, which seems to be totally irrational. Why would that happen? I mean, how can you go from poverty to plenty, back to poverty, and then back to plenty again? It doesn't make sense. There is no reason why you can't have a functional society and a functional world. We have resources and we can use them, and we can use them if we learned properly to distribute the results of using them to individuals. You could have a very stable existence for all people on the earth, really. And we have just tremendous abundance, where the problem is not primarily, maybe on a short-term basis, the problem of production. It is the problem of distribution. And distribution in our particular dispensation uses the instrument of money in order to make claims on wealth. And so those claims have to be properly distributed, equitably distributed to citizens at large. If business is going to be supported by the demand that allows it to recover its costs and to carry on in a stable manner, in an uninterrupted manner, in serving the community. Now, because of the financial system being the source of so many really, really serious and tragic and just absolutely horrific events like the 2 world wars and the wars that have continued, and the phenomenon of poverty, as you'll see even in the great United States, in cities like Los Angeles. It seems impossible to even accept for a moment the fact that these conditions exist. There's no need for them to exist. The grocery stores would be more than delighted to sell these people food if they had money to buy it. Mm-hmm. So, but the problem is all these difficulties and the dysfunction that goes into the political system too because of all these problems and the inability of the politicians or unwillingness of them to tackle the problem in a realistic manner. People are always looking for new answers. And when they can't find them locally, they naturally, I suppose, tend to look further abroad in order to seek answers to their problems. And they look at amalgamating their resources, one nation amalgamating with another nation, and so on and so forth, looking in a will-o'-the-wisp for solutions in that way. Because if you're going to carry on in a larger organization using the same defective or inadequate or false principles that you've used previously, all you're doing is magnifying and enlarging the problem. You are not solving it. And the idea of individual initiative is absolutely essential to the successful carrying out of any program. Now, if you have an enormous world organization, initiative is killed because individual initiative, cannot be allowed to interfere with the designs or plans, programs of the people who run or administer this increasingly centralized world organization. In other words, it's a centralization of power. And the centralization of power is contrary to the social credit policy of the decentralization of power. Douglas made it very, very clear that the state exists to serve the individual and not the individual to serve the state. Well, in the latter case, you have dictatorship.
Yeah, that's right. In the end, the power becomes so great that it becomes a dictatorship. And of course, the dictatorship ultimately is a world dictatorship. One person making decisions, or at least a cabal of people making decisions that affect absolutely everyone. And we see the reflection of this type of thing in Hong Kong at the moment. Hong Kong insisting that they have their sovereign right. In fact, they're calling on, some people in Hong Kong are calling on the British to restate its influence because the British have a history of being free people. But then again, look what's going on in Britain. The politicians are actively subverting what's going on. The Conservative and Labor combined are subverting. They won't let the people have the answer. They won't let it go back to a vote. And they're doing everything they can to subvert the will of the people. So Britain's not out of the woods, as is not France. France with the yellow vests, and they continue on. These are different groupings of people who are all struggling against this domination over their lives where they don't have an effective say. The antidote to world government, in my view, comes down to individual sovereignty, coming into association on things that you agree on. If you can agree that you need to, we spoke before about was it the Golden Gate Bridge, the actual construction. You agree that you need to build a bridge. then you can come together and do it. And so the financial credits should be released in order to actually cover the cost of construction of the bridge and let the community execute it. And then once it's completed, the cost should be fully liquidated. And this is a question that has not been answered for 400 years. It hasn't been answered certainly since the Industrial Revolution, but also the centralisation of banking through the establishment of central banks, Bank of England being the first. So we've got to consider these things in an antidote to world government. National sovereignty is important, but even state sovereignty, the individual sovereignty, it's called, in my view, it's called something like devolution, where power comes back. If you can make a valid decision and live with the consequences of it, then you should be left alone to do it. And handing power to a higher authority is the if you like the opposite. It's the opposite. So an antidote has to be something that actually deconstructs or undoes the world government. And that to me is a change of policy. This to me is you've got to be very clear about it in your mind. A change of policy. Not a change of government, a change of policy. Robert Klinck.
Well, the world we live in now is increasingly a top-down world. And as you were saying, Arnie, what we need is a world in which the desire for achievement and purpose arises from the population itself.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, I think we've been so long without people thinking in those terms because more and more initiative is being siphoned away from them, that it would require a considerable period of transition to go to the situation where initiative was arising from the population. And in order for that to happen, people have to be given sanctions. Right now, the sanctions are all in the hands of finance, because without money income, people are essentially helpless. And therefore, their initiative is surrendered to the people who are making available the money they need in order to survive. They create this policy of full employment, which in effect is just taking away the lives of people, because their lives are being turned to purposes they don't necessarily approve of or would pursue on their own. So there has to be a reversal of this position with the sanctions all coming down upon the people from the top. Now, a model for this is the European community, the European Union, because it is an organization that has a sort of simulacrum of representation. Representatives are sent to Brussels, but the policy is all decided by a committee of bureaucrats, and there is no possibility for the elected people to initiate proposals for policy. Well, this is what the goal is to install at the international level. And if you have a world government, it just means, as Wally was saying, that nothing can be allowed to interfere with its policies, because in effect then it wouldn't be a government.
Yeah, no, interesting, very interesting observation and comment there. Wally Klinck.
Well, it's a very, very intricate business, and my mind has been sort of following the argument and thinking of other things alternatively. But yes, if you have a bureaucracy that is not accountable to the general public, that bureaucracy will become increasingly autocratic and and ultimately dictatorial, because they will follow their desires, not being constrained by the general public, which is not given any sanctions by which to approve or disapprove of their performance. They will just go on their own track. They will build up bureaucracies and what do you call? What would you say? Sort of institutions within the system which serve their own ends and toward power and toward the mobilization of wealth and so on. And you will just end up with a dreadful, dreadful, unspeakable dictatorship. That's what you'll have. You've got to have diversity. Consumers have to be able to dictate the policy of production by their acceptance or rejection of the results that the producers not being organized in a democratic fashion, but being subject to the judgment of the consumers for their very survival. And that is what should discipline the producer. The acceptance or non-acceptance of his policy. You know, it's really quite disturbing. You've heard of this young Swedish girl, very, very young, who has been co-opted by the climate change enthusiasts in order to promote the cause. Now, she obviously has no qualifications. She has no technical qualifications, educational qualifications. She's putting forth an appeal to the world to save itself from this hypothecated dreadful scourge that is supposed to exist in climate change. And but what she said the other day was very interesting. She said, if we can save the banks, maybe we can save the world. Well, that is exactly the problem. It's the banks that have far too much power that is destroying the world as we would like to have it. And but it shows you how people can be co-opted. They can be brainwashed. They can be manipulated psychologically into supporting causes which are really not in their best interest or in the best interest of their neighbors. The girl, poor girl, she has no understanding of financing like that. She wouldn't, if we could engage her for a while, maybe we could persuade her of our position, but they've gotten to her first.
Yeah, no, interesting. I think, is her name Gretel? Is it Gretel or something like that? It's whatever.
I don't think it's Gretel.
Okay, but I guess the point is, yes, you can get duped into pursuing a cause without actually thinking it through, and the issue in my mind is something that actually does take discipline. It does take effort to actually think it through. You can't just come up with instant porridge and say, right, that's the solution. You've got to actually scroll down. You've got to go to the detail of what's actually happening and observe it. And now you look at things like the world debt clock. I keep bringing it up. Okay, well then look at something like climate change. Climate change. You've got to consider, what are the climate change advocates actually saying? That they're saying that, all right, she's saying that if we can protect the banks. I think it's more than that. I think that the history of climate change is actually one of fraud. And I understand that the hockey stick, the bloke who was responsible for the hockey stick, will not release the data. He will not release the data in order for it to go through the scientific rigor, the inductive method, to see if his science is valid or not. And I know that there were court cases, and I know that he's lost those court cases, and that to me is most important. Say, okay, the hockey stick, the upsurge of temperature is not realistic. It's not actual fact. It's just suspicion or consideration or opinion, but it's not reproducible fact, and that to me is very, very important. The inductive scientific method to me is a profound methodology of determining truth. Now, I read a book not long ago called The Destruction of History or something like that by Windshuttle, a bloke called Windshuttle. And what he said in that book was that the scientific method is as valid for establishing truth in history as it is for every other discipline. the scientific method. In other words, draw some facts together, come to an hypothesis, place it on the table, and let it go through scientific rigor. And if it can withstand rigorous testing, independent, impartial, blind studies, then you validate it, sorry. But if it can't hold that rigor, if you can't actually expose it to dissenting views, scientific views, and demonstrable views, then it has failed. The hypothesis doesn't stand. And that to me is a reflection in this climate argument. But it's also a reflection in this existing financial narrative. The existing financial system, it doesn't maintain a position of being representative of the abundance that is there. We have the technology, the release of the labour saving devices, advanced control, energy. I mean, energy coming out our ears, this peak oil. The weekend I read an article, it was a complete fabrication. No scientific rigor at all, no scientific substantiation, a complete fabrication. There is no shortage of energy. So then it comes back to, if climate change is not the issue, well, energy is not the issue. The debt clock shows that banking is a fraud and it's not in equilibrium, that there's sufficient spending power to liquidate the costs. You've got to come back to, well, these observable things, these demonstrable things, these repeatedly demonstrable things, the scientific method doesn't validate it. It doesn't validate it. It shows that it's actually the financial system is a confiscatory system. It actually, the debt, it imposes debt on individuals, nations, communities. And of course, in the end, it just draws all power to the central banks. That's what it's about. So the antidote to world government is to ensure that the individual has sufficient purchasing power to liquidate what the community can produce. It's the antidote to world government, but it's the sovereignty. The sovereignty is in the ability to choose or refuse, and you use your vote, your financial vote, in this manner, to choose or refuse. It's your independence, your claim on the cultural heritage. Robert Klinck.
Well, a lot of people have theorized that a state cannot exist in the absence of an external threat. And I think that we see in the succession of threats that are contrived for the world, increasingly on the scale of the world, an example of the application of this notion. And now they've come up with a dandy now with the climate change, because it encompasses all things and they can interfere in every aspect of human life on the pretext that something must be done, because otherwise we're heading for oblivion. Now, in the context of this, I think we have to recover the idea of the purpose of human life. And the purpose of human life that was expressed in the Christian world was that life was precious and that it held great potentialities, and everything should be done to release those potentialities. So if you have a planning of the world, then it is in conflict with this concept of the preciousness of individual life. So what is needed is a recognition of the Christian concept of the preciousness of human life, and a creation of institutions that will reinforce it. And in the Western world, those institutions had been developed to a great extent. But in recent decades, they're all being subverted. And we're going to this position where people are basically just drones in a hive. And their personal development and their personal relations really don't count for anything in the grand scheme. So we have to decide whether we value individual initiative and individual aspirations or not. And if we do, then we should be tailoring the institutions of the world to accommodate that, and not accommodating the individuals to some bureaucrat's grand scheme.
Yeah, the bureaucrat's utopia instead of the individual utopia. I did read it somewhere recently where the individual, every individual, should be a totalitarian in charge of themselves. And to me, that's an interesting comment because, of course, the totalitarian of the world, he wants to be in charge of everyone. Wally Klinck.
Well, that's right. The individual should have control over his own thoughts and his own motives and so on and so forth. That doesn't mean that you want to control your neighbors, but you don't want to infringe upon other people just because you want freedom for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And that would be contrary to freedom. But this environmental movement, it seems very much to be oriented toward asking people to literally reduce their standard of living, to increase the costs of energy and so on, actually not to improve their standard on the basis or on the promise of some future benefit, which has not been demonstrated. And in some cases, it's been demonstrated that some of these new techniques are not adequate or need considerable refinement in order to be competitive in the field. Now, it's great, it's wonderful, and it's the whole basis of advancing civilization that you have changing modes of production and so on and so forth. But it's best that the consumer should have an opportunity to say, hey, I like what you're doing, and it's really been a boon to me, and I'm going to support it. Mm-hmm. Or the consumer can say, you know, what you've done is not too helpful. It's been a nuisance. It's reduced my standard of living, and I'm not going to support it. Mm-hmm. But the consumer has to have the power to do that. Mm-hmm. And without the power to command the acceptance or rejection of those goods and services, which comes in our world in the form of purchasing power, then he's lost his power to control a situation. Yeah. And so it's very important. And people just do know, for instance, in Alberta here, the whole thing now that we've got a conservative government in office is really to revive the export of energy. And that has certainly been, in its own way, a relative benefit to Alberta in the past. But the thing of it is, you have to remember, when you are exporting, unless you're receiving an equivalent in goods and services in imports, you're actually impoverishing yourself on a physical standpoint. Mm. Because you are shipping out more real wealth than you're getting in return, in order that you can get financial credits, which are needed not to buy external goods, but to make your own system self-liquidating by liquidating your internal debts. Mm. So it's not a question of benefiting. I mean, trade has its benefits to the extent that it is trade, but increasingly trade is not trade. It is a war for markets, for export markets. And that, of course, as we know, is a very vexatious situation, which has caused all sorts of problems between nations, including war. And so, you know, rather than looking at the situation from the standpoint of what is the real credit? I mean, the physical ability of Albertans with the resources they have in terms of their human potential and their natural resources to provide a good standard of living for themselves. Mm-hmm. And to make it possible for them to activate those resources, and not only that, but for them to claim the results that flow from the application of these resources to production. No, they want to engage in the old method of exporting in order to try and capture external credits to satisfy your own unsound financial system. Mm. Would it not be a lot better for them to introduce a balanced price system, which made it possible for us to carry on in a relatively independent manner. And we could have a very high standard of living with our resources, I'm sure. Wouldn't that be a much better approach than this pursuit of external markets? I'm not saying that we shouldn't, if some other nations want our goods or our energy, and they can give us something in return, there's nothing wrong with that. But that's not the way it's set up today. It's a desperate situation. We're not going to survive if we don't sell our oil. Well, is oil the only essential aspect of living? And we certainly don't utilize all of our oil for our internal needs if we're exporting a lot of it. So we must have a considerable surplus. No, it's just a lack of purchasing power. It's a lack of recognition that people have a right to avail themselves of the results from their association. And a right to absorb those results, regardless of whether they are directly involved in labor or working in jobs, in producing them. If you can produce them by other means, by other factors of production, technology, well, that's marvelous. That is called progress, because then we can be released into a state of abundance where we also have the time to live a cultured life and not be on the treadmill all the time.
Yeah,
but that's nothing. Right. There's nothing in that for the banks.
That's right. Well put, Wally. That's very well put. I look at the time; it's 36 minutes already. I'm going to just open the closing comments by just suggesting that at the time of the tyranny of King John, where Magna Carta, the barons forced him to put his seal on there, what they were doing was they were taking away monopoly power or world government, at least for Britain at the time. It was British totalitarian government, taking away power, placing it in the hands of the barons and perhaps some of the church leaders. But the thing is that over the next 800 years, of which at least 700 years the evolution of representative government has been taking place, that transfer of power from the dictator has come down to the point where each person was given a vote. Now, women were only recently, in the last 100 years, given a vote. And I might add that some nations at the moment don't necessarily adhere to the same standard as is in the Westminster system. But the individual now has a vote, and each vote is equal. And so tyranny in the political sphere was responded to over 700 years to place that power in the hands of the individual. A similar tyranny is in existence today, and that tyranny is finance. And that finance is a dictator to the world. And the only way of responding to that is to place power back into the hands of the individual. And that's in the form of the national dividend consumer price discount. And you've got to consider what you're doing is you're placing a voting power, be it finance, but you're placing it back in the hands of the individual, away from the totalitarian in charge. Very, very important to consider it from that point of view. Closing comments, Robert Klinck.
Well, Magna Carta was designed not only to be of advantage to the barons, but it was to establish all individuals in a position of protection. You know, the invention of the jury system and all that. Who would have thought that up unless they were concerned with the individual and his being protected in the polity? So these institutions were developed and they were tested through the common law system, which was an organic development, and it became a tremendous heritage for particularly the British world, but these ideas have spread to other cultures as well. And it's an absolute tragedy that the whole thing is being subverted, and a double tragedy. And a lot of the subversion seems to be originating from the nation where these ideas were developed in the first place. So you're talking about a vote. Well, we don't need just a political vote. We've seen that the political vote doesn't really give us much control over anything. What we need is an economic vote and a money vote. And that is the decisive one. That would establish control by the population over the productive system and the political system.
Thank you for that, Robert. Closing comments, Wally.
Yes, we appear to have sold our freedom by accepting the political vote, but not even recognizing the possibility of the economic vote. And as Douglas said, political democracy without economic democracy is dynamite. In other words, we have, but through our system of voting for people politically, we have in effect, I'm afraid, literally validated the tyranny of finance, as you mentioned, Arnie, because it's not being challenged. We may spend our time fighting amongst ourselves over relative, maybe important issues in some cases, but they're issues that usually derive from the dysfunction of the financial system itself. And so therefore we have lost our inheritance, and it's been a dreadful loss for us. A loss in freedom, a loss in tragedy, wars, and waste. Douglas wrote an article called The Tragedy of Human Effort, which shows how completely we are enslaved to useless activities in order that we might live by accessing things that we've already produced. So, I mean, it's irrational. You know, I think the Bible says something about, I'm not necessarily becoming theological here, but about the folly of looking toward the ends of the earth. And when you talk about world government, that's what you're doing. You're looking to the ends of the earth to solve your problems, which might just be well solvable if you looked at home.
Yeah, no, beautifully put. Thank you so much for today's forum, gentlemen. It's been a treat, a real pleasure, as we've discussed the antidote to world government. Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Wally.
Thank you, Arnie.
Yeah, thank you, Arnie. Goodbye.
Cheers.